I don't have a cape. I can't rap. But I do have a superpower. And my superpower is coding. Now, I've been a coder for over 20 years. And so that means that I was a coder way before it was cool to be a coder. And I taught coding at the secondary level for 13 years, and it taught me some really interesting lessons about teaching and learning, and I'm going to share some of those with you today. I think we all stand on the shoulders of giants, and I wanted to start my talk by acknowledging some of the people that I really admire and that I've learned so much from. And the first people that I learned a lot from is fellow educators. I've learned so much throughout my career from other educators, and a lot of what I'm going to say today is based on those things that I learned from them. I also learned an awful lot from my students, and I'm going to share some of my student stories with you as well today. I come from a family of educators. My wife is a kindergarten teacher in the school board. Both of my parents were teachers. They retired last June. My sister's a teacher. My sister-in-law is a teacher. And I've learned from them an incredible amount from them. And then I've learned from coming to conferences like this, and some of you might see some kind of common themes, and that's because I've learned from those people as well. And finally, I've learned from a great group of people that I've had the privilege of working with for the past 3 years in the IT for Learning group, and you're the predominant group in the room, so thank you so much for being here. I want to start with a story of two girls. And this is one of the giants that I stand on. This is my grandmother. My grandmother lived from 1915 to 2005. And my grandmother loved puzzles, and she loved learning, but she really grew up in a different era. She grew up on the Manitoulin Island. She was the daughter of subsistence farmers. And the house that she grew up in didn't have running water. She went to a one-room schoolhouse. And for those of you that have ever been to the Manitoulin Island, it's basically like farming rocks. And my grandmother was poor. She lived in a very interesting time, but she got to see some amazing technology advances. My grandmother, in her lifetime, she saw the automobile become the primary mode of transportation. When she was a child, they traveled by horse and carriage, or sleigh in a lot of cases. She saw air travel become commonplace, nuclear energy, the space program, the personal computer. Near the end of her life, she saw the smartphone become a common technology. And probably the most important thing my grandmother saw that I'm the most jealous of, particularly today, is my grandmother was alive for every time the Toronto Maple Leafs won the Stanley Cup. Maybe next year. This is my daughter, Charlotte. She was born in 2010. She's in grade 2 in our board. And I think a lot about Charlotte. And if my daughter lives the same length of time as my grandmother, she'll die in the year 2100. And what technology is she going to see in her lifetime? And how is that going to affect her learning, her career, and her life? What can I do, my wife and I do as parents to help her? And what can we do as educators to prepare her for the future that she's going to be facing? And I think it's an exciting future, but it's very different than what my grandmother faced. Throughout this talk, I'm going to use some code to kind of introduce my main points. And this code, this reads, while true, learn plus plus. And in computer languages, plus plus means you're increasing a value. So what this really says is forever learning increases. And I think as teachers, we have to be people who are forever increasing our knowledge. And as a computer teacher, I was forced into that because the technology was changing so rapidly. And not only was the technology changing rapidly, but the languages were changing. And so I always had to be learning. That's very different than the experiences of many of my colleagues. Frankly, Pythagorean theorem hasn't really changed significantly in 2,000 years. But there are major differences today compared to even the beginning of my career in computing. Because of those changes, I had to take a different stance with my class than many teachers take. And that was that I'm not an expert. I had to acknowledge my lack of expertise because nobody is an expert in computer coding. Anyone that tells you that they are is either delusional or lying. And in my case, I had to stand in front of my class and acknowledge that lack of expertise, and that changed the way that I could teach. I had to learn to struggle along with my students to learn at the same time that they were learning. And I think that example changed the way that they approached me as a co-learner in their classroom. I think it's important that our students see us learning. And to do that, we have to set some things up. We have to set up a classroom where we're doing things that we haven't done before. And that's not always easy. I have to model and design projects where I'm forced to learn at the same time as my students. Now, that becomes very difficult as a teacher because if I'm constantly learning along with my students, I have to come up with some strategies in order to make that work in my classroom. And one of those strategies is my next point, where I want my students to become the experts. So my trick in my room was a student would come up to me and ask me a question, and we'd work together and figure out a solution. And then I would tell that student, you're now my expert on that problem. And when other students ask, I'm going to point them to you. And we all know as teachers that the best way to learn something is to teach it. And so I'm making that student my expert by having that student teach the material. And so when the students would come to me, by creating those experts in the room, I would point the student to that. When the student would ask me a question, I would point them to that other student. So the next student that came up and asked me the same question that William had asked, I would say, you know what? William and I talked about that yesterday, and we solved that problem together. We came up with a really interesting solution. I want you to go and talk to William, and if you still don't understand after you've talked to William, then come back and talk to me. And 90% of the time, that solved the problem. The student talked to William and got the answer that he or she was looking for. So I have to build some of that into my practice. So an example of this was when I was a young teacher. I went to my first interview for a contract job, and the principal said to me, would you be interested in teaching computer technology? And at the secondary level, computer technology is the course that has to do with hardware and networking and electronics. And I really didn't have a background in that area. And so, you're a young teacher, you want a job, so you say, yeah, of course, that'd be great. That'd be really interesting. I'd love to learn about that. And I distinctly remember about the third week of September, sitting in my classroom on my prep period, getting ready to teach that class, and the thought struck me, I've taught everything I know about this topic, and it's the third week of September. Now what am I going to do? And that course hadn't been running in the school before I was there, and so there was no one I could go to in the building. And so I decided, you know what, I have to use my students, and we've got to figure this out together. So if you can imagine, I was teaching in the machine shop, and there were lathes and mills and stuff like that, and we'd scrounged together about 4 or 5 computers. We'd gone into cupboards and, kind of in under textbooks and come up with a few computers to use. And we'd got them up and running, and we decided, the next thing we need to do is we want to try and network these computers. And this was in 2002, and this was before really home networks existed. Most people only were lucky if they had one computer. And so I said to the class, I don't know anything about networking. I know nothing about networking. Let's figure this out together. So we went down to the computer lab, and different students researched different parts of what we needed to do. And at the end of class, they came to me and said, Mr. Whittington, we think we need a router or a hub, and we need some network cable and some network cards, and we think if we've got that, we can put together some kind of ad hoc network. I said, perfect. What's all that going to cost? They said, well, we can go to Future Shop, and you can buy this stuff. And I said, well, we don't really have a budget for this course. And so I made a phone call to the IT department, and the IT department with the board has always been amazing. And they said, yeah, we've got some old stuff sitting, in a closet that we can send out. And so they sent me this stuff. And one of the things we got were network cables like this one on the left. And I was kind of, none of us knew what to do with them. But then one of my students, Rob, piped up and said, well, I've got a co-op with the town, and part of my job is we're building a new network. And so I know how to do this. So I said, okay, Rob, what do we need? Well, we need a crimper tool, and we need some pliers. I said, okay, what do I do with that? Oh, I think they have them at Radio Shack. You can go get them for about $20. So that night I went to Radio Shack. We got the stuff. And the next day in class, Rob taught the class how to make a network cable. To this day, nearly 20 years later, I still teach creating network cables in the same way that Rob taught me. That learning, that teaching from Rob, my student, has gone on to teach hundreds of students how to do that same skill. And I think when we use the room, we can really build some capacity within our schools and within our classroom. Now, that's a scary place to be. It's scary to stand in front of a class of people, of students, and not know. And so my next point is the exclamation mark in coding is the not symbol. So how this reads is not knowing does not equal stupid. And we have to model this with our students, because when our students see us as experts, they feel like they have to be experts. And what they do is just regurgitate the same information that we're giving them back to us. And I don't think that that's very healthy. I want my students, we've heard a lot about risk. I want my students to be risk takers. They're not going to take risk when they don't see me taking risk. When they see me as the expert, they feel like they have to be the expert as well. The story goes that when an elephant is being trained for the circus, they get the elephant when it's really young. And they put a big, heavy iron cuff on the elephant's ankle. And they get heavy rope or chain. And then they drive a big stake into the ground. And that elephant learns that if it pulls on that rope, it can't go any further. And as the elephant gets older, they actually can decrease the size of the cuff and the size of the chain and the size of the stake until the point when the elephant's an adult, it could very easily break free, but it doesn't. I think that's a lot like how we operate when it comes to risk. We've learned our limitation, and we don't pull on the rope. I think we have to pull on the rope, and we have to allow our students to pull on the rope in order to achieve great things. There should be sound here.
A note that read, "Wasting her time. She's too shy to put her best foot forward." Turned down by the Decca Recording Company, who said, "We don't like their sound, and guitar music is on the way out." A failed soldier, farmer, and real estate agent. At 38 years old, he went to work for his father as a handyman. Cut from the high school basketball team, he went home, locked himself in his room, and cried. A teacher told him he was too stupid to learn anything, and he should go into a field where he might succeed by virtue of his pleasant personality. Fired from a newspaper because he lacked imagination and had no original ideas. His fiancée died. He failed in business twice. He had a nervous breakdown, and he was defeated in 8 elections. If you've never failed, you've never lived.
Now, I want to point out that all of these people actually have two things in common. The first is what this video is about. They had failures in their lives. But let's be honest with each other. Ultimately, the reason we're talking about these people is because they were successful. Nobody makes a video about the thousands of basketball players that don't make their grade 9 basketball team every year. We talk about Michael Jordan because he was successful. And I think failure is we've used as educators failure as it's almost a dirty word. And now it's becoming vogue to talk about failure, but failure ultimately isn't beneficial if it isn't the first step to success, if it doesn't lead to success. And we have to do some things in our classroom to set our classrooms up so that that can happen. The first thing that I wanted to do in my classroom is I wanted to work towards mastery. Because really, who do you want running the nuclear plant? The woman on the left looks like she's fairly competent, probably knows what she's doing. Homer Simpson, maybe not. We want mastery for our students. I want my student to be like this woman, not like Homer Simpson. My cousin David works for Bruce Power, and he trained for 4 years with Bruce Power to be a nuclear operator, which means he would be the last, the ultimate person, decision maker in the plant. And of his cohort of about 25 people, only 2 people got to the point where they could test to become a nuclear operator. And of those 2, David was one of them. Of those 2, neither one of them ultimately succeeded in becoming a nuclear operator. So when we talk about risk, we have to have some kind of safety net for people to take risks in. And my cousin David, even though he's not going to be a nuclear operator, is still in a management track position with Bruce Power. With our students, in order for our students to take risks, we have to make process greater than product. Process has to be more important than product in order for our students to take risks. About 12 years ago, I had a group of students that wanted to build a robot. And they came to me at the beginning of September and they said, "Mr. Whittington, we want to build a robot." I said, "Okay, I'm into robots. Let's build a robot." And they said, "Not only that, we want to build a robot that can be controlled over the internet." I said, "All right, that sounds a bit ambitious, but let's try that. And not only do we want to control it over the internet, we want it to have a webcam on it so we can watch over the internet what the robot's seeing." I said, "Great, let's do it." So the group worked, and they worked on that robot. They built a chassis. They put motors in it. They figured out the controls. But ultimately, at the end of the term, they weren't successful in. The robot didn't do everything they wanted it to do. And I gave them 100%. And they came to me and they said, "Mr. Whittington, it didn't work. Why did you give us 100%? And I said, "Well, you learned everything about this course in the process of building that robot. The fact that you ultimately had a couple of glitches or bugs in the final product didn't really change the amount that you'd learn. Your learning was still there. That's what I'm ultimately looking for." I remember one of my students, Darius, came back. He went to the University of Waterloo in their mechatronics program, and he came back a couple years later. I think he was in third year, and he said, "Mr. Whittington, why on earth did you let us build that robot? Like, my fourth year project next year is simpler than that. That was a crazy project. Like, that was so difficult." And I said, "Yeah, but you didn't know that at the time when you started. You wanted to build that, and so you learned so much from doing it." I said, "Would you have learned more if I said no and made you do something that was simpler that you would have achieved very easily?" He kind of thought about it. He said, "No, we would have never learned as much." The only reason that those students were willing to take that risk is because I allowed them to do it, and I allowed them to have that process to be more important. So ultimately, I think all of the people that were involved in that project learned a lot of things from the failures of those robots. The other thing that I learned fairly quickly, and I'm sure many of you have seen this before, is that I wanted my students to work to their strengths. So that group that was building the robot, I had one student that was looking to be an electrician, and so that student did a lot of the wiring on the robot. Another student was in machine shop, and so that student was really interested in metalwork, and he built a lot of the chassis of the robot. There was other students that were interested in programming, and there were other students that were interested in web design, and they did a lot of the interfacing. By letting each of those students work to their strengths, they achieved far more than if they were all doing the same thing in that group. By allowing those students to work on their strengths, it really changed the way that project turned out. And if we really believe in teamwork and we really believe in collaboration, part of that has to be allowing our students to work to their strengths. Now, that means that we have to change a little bit about what we do. And the first thing that I think we have to change is we have to make our projects very open-ended. A lot of times, I remember when differentiation was something that we were starting to talk about in education, and teachers in the staff room would complain, and they'd say, "Oh, how am I supposed to do that? Am I supposed to make 30 different worksheets?" No, of course not. But if you allow the students to drive the learning, and if you allow their passions to drive the learning, you'll never get this. If you assign a project and get back 30 of the exact same thing, that's not a project. That's a recipe. And I think often what happens is we are assigning recipes. But if we make our projects open-ended, then we get far more interesting things. And if we allow our students to follow their own passions, we get far more interesting things. And I'll let you in on a secret. It's way more interesting as a teacher. There was nothing worse than marking 30 papers that were all exactly the same. You get to the end of that stack and you're just like, oh, I can't take it anymore. But when we allow our students to follow their passions, it makes our jobs more interesting as well as our students. Another thing that I learned early on in this process was, and I learned this from Garfield Jeannie Newman, to give the students the project first and then design the learning to fit with the project. What we traditionally do in school is we do a whole bunch of learning, and then we assign some kind of final project where the students are basically proving that they learned what we just taught them. The subtle change here is that by defining the project first, all of the learning is contributing to the project. And even better if the students are defining the project and then I'm trying to fit the learning, fit the teaching into what the student wants to do. Because the student is going to understand the purpose of the learning best when it's in context, when they understand it. I remember taking my first year calculus course in university, and we were doing differential equations. I could solve a differential equation. I still can't tell you why I would ever solve a differential equation. That was never discussed. We were learning to calculate, but we weren't learning a purpose. So I would have students would build games, and they'd build robots and arcade machines and all kinds of different things. And when I could put the learning in context, it made a lot more sense. So this is a quick little video of Mario, but there's actually a lot of interesting things happening in this video where the student is going to learn some mathematics, some physics, the way that Mario jumps, the way that Mario expands. There's a whole bunch of things happening here that contribute to the learning of my student that they wouldn't have learned as easily if they weren't trying to build a game. Now, the next thing that I learned has to do with feedback. And I don't think early in my career I understood feedback very well at all. And the main reason I didn't understand feedback, I think, was because I don't think I had ever seen a model of good feedback. What I found I was doing early in my career was my feedback was justifying the mark. So my students would produce a report, let's say, and they'd hand it in on Friday, and being the diligent teacher that I was, I would take it home on the weekend and go through it and grade it. And then on Monday, I would hand it back, and it would have a mark, and it would have some feedback written on it. But really, that feedback was justifying the mark. It was there to say, you got a 75, and here's why. And what happened was this. I would look in their recycling bin at the end of class on Monday, and there it would be right full of all these papers that I'd spent the whole weekend writing feedback on. I don't know if the students read it. Probably some of them did, but a lot of them just ignored it, I'm sure. And so what I discovered was I needed to create what's called a feedback loop. And a feedback loop in electronics is when an output is fed back into an input. So in a speaker system like this, if I held the microphone up to the speaker's an output, the microphone's an input, and you get that high squealing noise, that's a feedback loop. And so what I discovered is I had to create feedback that was actionable. And by actionable feedback, what I mean is I had to create something where the student could actually do something with it. Let's be honest, I also taught English some, and my grade 12 English class, if they wrote an essay on Hamlet, and I spent a lot of time creating feedback for that, and I handed it back to them with a mark, 99% of those students are never writing another essay on Hamlet. So that feedback, they can't do anything with it. There's nothing to be done with that feedback. So what I started to do, and I felt this kind of disconnect, I felt uncomfortable with what I was doing, and so I decided I need to give better feedback, but I have to make some changes. And one of the big changes was I got rid of due dates. And instead of due dates, I sort of had a vague period of time where I wanted to see some results of what the students were doing. So I would go in on Monday morning and I would say, this week, sometime, I want to see your project. When you're ready, you come up and see me and we'll look at the project. And so my students, one of them would raise his or her hand and come up and say, Mr. Whittington, I think I'm ready for you to look at this. And in the context of coding, usually it was a program, and we'd sit down together side by side and we'd run the program. And sometimes there'd be some bugs or the program would crash. And maybe there'd be a spot in the program where it wasn't really clear to the user what you were supposed to do, and maybe their documentation wasn't super clear. And so what I would say is, you saw it crash there, right, when I pressed this? Yeah, I saw that. I think I know what's going on there, and I can fix that. And then I'd say, and that other section, as the user, I wasn't really sure whether I was supposed to press a letter or a number or what I was supposed to do there. The student would say, yeah, I get that. I'll fix that for you. All right, cool. And so I would say to the student, what do you think, what should your grade be right now? And the student would say, well, I'd say it's out of 20. And the student would say, well, I think maybe it's a 14. And I'd say, well, I think maybe you're selling yourself a little bit short. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put 15 out of 20 in my grade book. But what I want you to do is I want you to go back to your seat, and I want you to work on these 3 things. And I'd repeat the things that we had talked about to the student. And once you've done those things, you come back and see me. And sometimes it would take a day. Sometimes it would take a week. But the student would come back and see me, and they say, Mr. Whittington, I think I fixed it. Remember those 3 things that we talked about? I think I fixed those things. And now let's look at it again. And so I'd sit down and look at it again with the student. And sure enough, the student had fixed those things. And I would say, okay, well, now you've fixed it. Now it's 20 out of 20. Because ultimately, I care that the student is learning. I don't care when the student is learning. And so by giving them that safety net, they were willing to take more risks. The last thing that I learned teaching coding is if stuck, break. Teaching coding, many of my students had to struggle. And I think that struggle was important. And I modeled that with my students. I said, it's important to let a problem rattle around in your head and to think about it and to give yourself time to solve the problem. And sometimes when you're stuck, all you need to do is get up and go and have a drink. Or go for a quick walk. Sometimes you need to sleep on it. And so when my students came to me and had a question that I couldn't solve right away, I would often say to them, I need to think about it. I'm not really sure. Let's talk about it tomorrow. Come up and see me right at the beginning of class tomorrow, and we'll sit down and we'll figure this out together. 9 times out of 10, when that student came back the next day, one of us had solved the problem in our heads over the course of the night. And those other few times, we would sit down and almost immediately one of us would find the problem. We need time to think. Now, I think there's a real value in struggle. I don't think there's a value in frustration. And I think it's a very subtle line, very subtle difference. And masterful teachers know how far to push the student, and that line is different for every kid. And I've seen some wonderful teachers know how to push the students right to the limit where they're just about to go into the zone of frustration and pull them back and maintain that zone of struggle where they're trying for something. Because you don't get this reaction without struggle. This reaction is based on struggle. These kids have obviously been working hard at trying to figure something out, and they finally got it. Struggle is part of the process. And when we spoon feed our students, we don't get this reaction. I've never seen a student react this way to completing a worksheet. It doesn't happen. The last thing I want to talk about, this is a great example of both struggle and taking a break. This is my family. This is day 6 of a 9-day, 90-kilometer canoe trip last summer in Killarney Provincial Park. Guys, Max, I did have quite a beard going. And that trip really was a struggle. We had to work hard as a family. We had to work together to accomplish what I think is a pretty amazing thing. It was also a great opportunity to take a break. And I think as teachers, we have to allow ourselves those opportunities to take a break and to recharge and to get ready for the next things to come. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today. Thank you for the things that you're doing in schools to make things wonderful for our students. Thanks again. Have a great weekend.